It was time. Time to figure out what it all meant. Max Payne 3 is a 2012 third-person shooter developed by Rockstar Games. As the name implies, it's the sequel to the previous two Max Payne games developed by Remedy Entertainment in the early 2000s. As would be expected, the game plays similarly to the old ones, and while the original's level design was more open and there weren't cover mechanics, the DNA of the game is pretty much the same. From start to finish, you're mostly just mowing people down in slow-mo with a multitude of different weapons, occasionally broken up by a scripted action sequence or cutscene. All of these games are pretty much the same in that sense. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing at all. In fact, it's part of why I've played these games so many times. The gameplay is simple but satisfying. It feels like playing a John Woo movie. But I'm not bringing up the gameplay first because it's particularly interesting or mind-blowing. In fact, I'm kind of doing it because of the opposite reasons. Because, in a lot of ways, the gameplay is so similar and repetitive. It's a lot of fun, yes, but I don't have any hot takes on the change between slow-mo times in Max Payne 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. Nor do I think there's really much to talk about. If you're wondering if Max Payne 3 is a good game mechanically, but I'm not here to talk about that. No. What I'd really like to talk about is story and tone and themes. In Max Payne 3 you play as, well, Max Payne. The titular, broken, alcoholic, painkiller-addicted sad boy with a penchant for monologuing about his suffering. Now, this has always been the case for Max, and although it's cliched, in this outing we see him at his lowest, boozing around from shootout to shootout, barely able to hit water when he pisses, much less save a woman who's been kidnapped and ransomed. Oh yeah, did I mention that? There's a woman who's been kidnapped and ransomed. In fact, it was the wife of wealthy Brazilian millionaire Rodrigo Branco, who hired Max as a bodyguard for his wife. Did I mention that Max isn't very good at his job? For the first act of the game, we go through mission to mission, but he's really going from drink to drink. Cutscene after cutscene, in between missions, right before missions, Max is drunk. He can't get through the day without alcohol. Things start to escalate despite him and his new friend Passos' best efforts. Yeah, that guy, Passos, he dragged Max into all this with the promise of being a worry-free bodyguard in Brazil. But that didn't work out, and soon Max and Passos find themselves trying to save Rodrigo Branco's wife Fabiana and keep the rest of the people in the family, including Rodrigo's brothers Victor and Marcello, and his wife's sister Giovanna, from also getting killed. So when Max and Passos, oh yeah, you should be taking notes. All of this is very important in 20 minutes. So, when Max and Passos try to get Fabiana back from the kidnappers, a street gang known as the Comando Sombra led by a man named Serrano, they are interrupted by a right-wing paramilitary gang known as the Crusha Preto. And when they try to just go kill the Commando Sombra and get Fabiana back, they fail. And when Max is at Rodrigo Branco's headquarters, they get assaulted by the Crusha Preto, and Rodrigo Branco gets shot in the head. So Max decides to sober up and try to save at least Fabiana. But when he starts prowling the favelas, he meets a cop named De Silva who tells Max that Victor Branco, Rodrigo's brother and also right-wing politician, already had ties to the Crusha Preto. And when Max goes to the Commando Sombra to get Fabiana back, he sees that Fabiana's sister Giovanna and Rodrigo's other brother Marcello have tried to go by themselves to get Fabiana. And that all culminates in Serrano killing Fabiana and taking Marcello and Giovanna away, which leads to Max chasing after them as a right-wing police faction known as the UFE raids the favelas, shooting innocent people and busing them up by the dozens to take them to an unknown location. But Max is too late, as once he catches up to Marcello and Giovanna, Marcello is burned alive by one of the leaders of the Crusha Preto. Max manages to kill the Crusha Preto leader and save Giovanna, who reveals she's pregnant with Passos' baby. But the next day, after even more waves of Crusha Preto hitmen, Giovanna escapes with Passos, who leaves Max behind. But luckily Max is picked up by the cop he met earlier, Da Silva, who reveals that Victor Bronco actually sent Passos specifically to get Max, an ex-cop with an extreme history of violence. Da Silva then sends Max to where the UFE was busing civilians. Inside, he finds the organ trafficking ring that preys off the lower classes of Sao Paulo, run by the Caixa Preto. But once he gets the innocent people out, he decides to confront the other leader of the Caixa Preto, Neves, who tells Max he's just a dumb American pretending to be a hero, so Max blows the building up. And as it's coming down, Passos comes and saves him. Passos and Giovanna then leave to try and find a happy life together. Max then tries to help Da Silva try and stop Victor Bronco and a high-ranking member of the UFE known as Becker by giving himself up to a police station, and when he's inside, the prisoners and the former Commando Sombra rise up in a riot against the UFE. The whole thing was basically a scheme on the part of Victor Bronco and Becker to get an angry dude to come in and shoot up the place so that the UFE could have an excuse of an increase in violent crime to detain people and eventually sell them to the Caixa Preto. And it works for Victor Bronco, who is a right-wing politician who uses gang violence and crime as a platform to get elected. For anyone who is justifiably confused by this, that's what's happening in the game. That's what Max means when he says,
"What about me?"
You. You're the fall guy. The American. Running around, acting like the action hero. It's an awful tragedy for Victor, huh? A man running on a law and order ticket, you know, whose brothers have both been killed in such terrible circumstances. A true patriot.
Okay, so that's like a lot. Like a lot. But the important things are there. Max is depressed, and he sucks at his job, and constantly fails at it.
Oh my God, don't you kill her! Don't you! Oh my God, don't you kill her! Don't you! Don't you kill her!
Okay.
The people in power are abusing their status and position to exploit those with less than them. Max is used by and for corruption only to try and turn his life around and seek justice in the end. It's a story. And depending on how you look at it, I think there might even be a decent one in there somewhere. Which brings me to... For me to try and mount a case for this game, I have to talk about film noir. Film noir, as a genre/style, is hard to definitively pin down exactly what it is. So much to the point that the first thing in its Wikipedia entry is how hard it is to come up with a solid definition as to what it is. From what I've seen and read, a large portion of 30s, 40s, and 50s melodrama that usually contained some kind of dark or seedy criminal element were later mostly encompassed into the term film noir, with its literal translation being dark film, or black film. Fuck me, I can't remember. So when talking about film noir, we usually just observe the stylistic choices, themes, and plot elements that were commonly used within the melodramas of that time and say, there, that's film noir. It's a lot less of a solid descriptor for what you're getting, like horror or comedy are, and it's more of a, it's film noir. That being said, the elements of a typical film noir are usually seen to be contrasting shadows, black blacks, and white whites. Tones that are often dark and thick with tension. The themes usually focus on the bad side of humanity, the balance between right and wrong, and how human temptations often blur that line and cause people to cross it. They usually take place in seedy cities riddled with crime. Oftentimes the protagonist is a well-meaning, typically man, who finds himself in a web of corruption and conspiracy so deep that we only ever really get to see the surface of it. The antagonists of these movies are almost always the rich and powerful, either as cops or crime bosses, or often the line between the two are blurred. Or just, you know, gays. Now that's barely even scratching the surface of what it entails. For example, some can be surreal, horrifying, or comedic. The label is so all-encompassing and varying that to give every possible facet of what it means would take up most of this video. And obviously, to make my point seem more valid, I've kept it to what I consider to be the basics. So now we finally get to the first two Max Payne games, and I consider those to be pretty hardline film noir. In both games, Max finds himself wound up in a labyrinthian world of corruption. The storytelling often uses the same contrasting shadows and surreal camera angles, and the protagonist is a cop whose itchy trigger finger leads him down a trail of corruption, always involving other cops. And though he usually kills the bad guys, it never really leads to any positive change and basically destroys him internally. Like, the plot of the first game is that he goes on a mob-killing rampage after his fellow detective is murdered, and he uncovers a plot by a pharmaceutical company trying to make a super soldier drug for the US military, but it ends up becoming a horribly addictive problem on the streets. Max also finds out that most of the crime and politics in New York are controlled by a shadowy organization called the Inner Circle, and even though Max killed the lady in charge of the pharmaceutical company, the Inner Circle still maintains control of New York and all the mobsters. And all the mobsters he murdered barely even put a dent in crime. Oh yeah, and Max got addicted to painkillers while doing all this. And I can't even get into the plot of Max Payne 2 without getting into another long-winded, rambling explanation of it, so I'll just say it's about Max falling in love with a criminal, murdering another cop over it, and then the woman dies. And while Max kinda gets over his dead wife, still nothing changes and everything sucks. So yeah, these games are pretty film noir-esque, albeit in a sort of modern-day comic book way. Now with all that, we finally get to talk about Max Payne. But before we can talk about Max Payne 3, we have to talk about neo-noir. If you thought film noir was a poorly thought out, vague label that encompasses a wide variety of stylistic, narrative, and thematic choices, then you'll be endlessly frustrated with neo-noir, which is twice as hard to pin down because no one actually knows what the fuck it is. Some people might say that neo-noirs are noirs that take place in the future, like Blade Runner. But that would be ignoring the broad mass of crime films coming out in the 60s and 70s that were classified as neo-noir. So without trying to oversimplify it, if I were to give my own personal definition of neo-noir, I would say that it is a subversion of film noir through a contemporary lens. Like, a neo-noir can contain all the same plot, style, and themes of film noir, but it's almost a manner of how you present it. Going back to Blade Runner, the story, style, and tone are all lifted from classic film noir. The plot is about an experienced detective forced out of retirement inhabiting a shady, crime-ridden LA, where the Tyrell Corporation seems to have shadowy control over many of the facets of the city. How it ends up differentiating itself is mostly in the thematic. It takes basic film noir statements about right and wrong and tries to broadly apply them to a larger human experience, going so far as to question the protagonist's preconceived notions of what a human experience even is. It's taking the base components of film noir and building on them or subverting them in some way. For a completely opposite example, Shane Black's Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. It's a 2005 comedy about a petty criminal accidentally walking into an acting gig and being flown to LA to spend time with a private investigator, only for them to actually get wrapped up in a complex murder scheme. The film mocks the tropes of noirs set or centered in LA in the film industry. It has the woman from the protagonist's past trope manifest as a girl the protagonist knew in elementary school, and often offsets the typical grim or dark tone with a comedy that specifically plays off that darkness. In this way, it's playing with the tone and tropes of the film noir for the purpose of comedy, rather than building off them in any thematic way. But despite the radical differences in story, tone, and presentation, they're both neo-noir films, specifically for their subversion, deconstruction, or addition to the plot, stylistic, or thematic elements of film noir. Okay, Max Payne 3. Finally, Max Payne 3 is a neo-noir contrasted against its very much film noir predecessors. The easiest way to see this is in the game's styles. While the first few games were shadowy treks through the underbelly of New York City, where crime and corruption lies just out of sight in the dingy apartment buildings and behind the locked doors of multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical companies, the Sao Paulo presented in Max Payne 3 is an openly impoverished and dangerous place, no matter if you're in the slums or in a high-class nightclub. The music has switched from simple piano ballads and orchestral scores to an electronic, not quite synthy soundtrack provided by noise rock band Health that goes from mournful and sad to sleek and dirty to just plain prime. But really, the biggest change is the titular sad boy himself, Max Payne. In the original games, Max easily fit into the archetype of the typical noir protagonist. Someone who's generally an average person. They're usually capable enough to navigate the world of shadowy corruption without getting themselves killed, but are rarely competent enough to consistently come out on top of it, or really even overcome their own faults and temptations. There tends to be a sort of dry wit about them, often able to see the humor and hopelessness in the situations they find themselves in. And the monologue. In my opinion, pretty much the most film noir thing a protagonist can do is monologue about the darkness and amorality that surrounds you. And boy, does Max Payne monologue cynically about the darkness and amorality that surrounds him.
Valkyr had been meant to be a white-winged maiden that would lift you to a warrior's heaven, but it turned out to be a one-way demon ride to hell. The devil was in the drug. I knew. I had met him.
So, in the first two Max Payne games, Max Payne is the typical noir protagonist. In fact, one of the main differences between Max and the characters he was inspired by is that Max is just actually, like, insanely good at murdering people with guns. Despite being a depressed widower painkiller addict, Max approaches the conflict he finds himself in with a slick and sardonic sense of self-awareness. He references that he knows he's acting like a typical noir detective man, and he fully recognizes both the fatality and the absurdity of the labyrinthian conspiracy he finds himself caught in, and embraces it. In a lot of ways, Max Payne of the first two games is such a generic archetype of the film noir characters that the only thing that really makes him feel different from the characters that came before him is, well, honestly, the quality of Max's writing and performance.
The past is a gaping hole. Your only chance is to turn around and face it. But it's like kissing the lips of your dead love. Darkness waiting in the hole of your mouth.
Everything works in tandem to create a high-wire act of balancing the tone, which switches between self-aware camp and genuine melancholic drama with bits of dry humor mixed in. And the end product is a character who's simultaneously slick and competent, full of wit, sympathetic, and yet also just kind of tragic. And Max Payne 3 does none of that! Or at least, not in the same way. And there are good reasons for that. Some of which has to do with the changes in developers that I'll get into later, others of which come from the changes that accompany the subtle switch in style and tone that comes from changing film noir to neo-noir. In the same way that the switch from New York to Sao Paulo came with the seedy underbelly of crime going from a dingy problem that lurks away in the night shadows to being a big problem out in the open for everyone to see, the same thing happens to Max. Instead of being this slick, self-aware, competent protagonist who's able to stay on top of things despite the core of his personality being a mess of repressed anger and grief, Max has effectively let his worst nature take over him. Instead of his addictions being yet another problem in addition to his greater pain inside, they have completely taken over his life. He spends his day in a stupor of alcohol and painkillers. The first few missions, he's either wasted or hungover. He isn't the quick-dodging, gunslinging American Chow Yun Fat anymore. He's some old guy barely keeping up. And the first half of the game is just scene after scene of Max consistently failing to do the job he was hired to do.
I ain't slipping, man. I'm slipped. Never let me slip, cause if I slip, then I'm slipping.
Where he used to be able to shoot up an entire billion-dollar company's building full of hired mercs, now he struggles with just a few local hoods. This change is reflected in the monologue as well. Instead of ruminations about the underbelly of mankind, Max just comes off as downtrodden and bitter. What used to be elaborate metaphors filled with melancholy have been turned into cynical observations that are usually turned inward towards Max himself.
First day off the sauce, and somehow I'd still ended up in the gutter.
What little self-respect Max did have has turned completely into self-pity. Although, the quality is definitely a lot lower.
These guys weren't messing around. This place was like Baghdad with G-strings.
And you know, of course Max isn't busting out the elaborate metaphors. He's been frying his brain with booze and pills for 10 years. I'd be surprised if he even remembers what a metaphor is. And so the setup for Max Payne 3 provides us with both a setting and a protagonist that seem to take the dark, ugly core that lie in the shadows of the first game and put them out in the open where everyone can see. From here on out, we see the game go in a very different direction from its predecessor in terms of theme and tone. What serves as a setup that specifically takes aspects of the first games and is both elaborating and subverting them, also then goes on to go against what the initial setup seems to suggest. To really show what I'm talking about, I'm gonna have to contrast this with Max Payne 2. One of the most dominant themes in Max Payne 2 is the acceptance of both who Max is and the things that have happened to him. The plot is basically about Max trying to solve a case and falling in love with one of the suspects, which escalates into pretty much most of the people Max thought were on his side being backstabbers. The only brief moments of happiness are only shared between Max and Mona, and Max's arc in the game is tied to him being an impulsive murder guy who kills one of his fellow detectives for trying to arrest his lover. So when Mona gets killed, he comes to a sort of acceptance of both his wife's death and who he is as a person to have let this happen. It's a really cynical game where Max doesn't really save the day so much as he just kills all the people who gets in his way. Max Payne 3, on the other hand, as previously stated, starts out overtly cynical and misanthropic. Throughout the first chunk of the game, you never really get the feeling that Max even has the chance of rising to the challenge. There aren't any brief moments of joy or happiness except for a quip or two between Max and Passos. For the most part, you're witnessing Max barely keeping up, unable to save himself or anybody else. But that's just the game's setup. Max's arc is ultimately one of bringing himself together, and while Max's lowest point in 2 saw him murdering another detective for selfish reasons, Max's lowest point in 3 sees him failing to protect his boss, which results in the guy's death. As Max resolves to still try and save the guy's wife, he goes to grab a drink and sees a bomb, narrowly escaping the explosion. And after having a breakdown in his apartment, Max resolves to quit drinking, and to just try and do something good. Him shaving his head is a pretty obvious visual metaphor. Going back to Max Payne 2, the story was about Max trying to solve a case about a group of mercenaries posing as a cleaning company while trying to protect his lover from other police officers, which results in him not solving the case, but roping his chief into it and getting him killed, and just murdering the guy behind it all. And it ends with his lover dying. He comes to grip with who he is, but it's also kinda because he fucked up so spectacularly that everyone around him died.
Now, like all my loves, she is mine forever. She has brought me here to this moment of clarity, where time slows down and I choose to look back to see myself. And in that act of seeing, I am reborn.
But in Max Payne 3, things are different. While Max fails to help Rodrigo, Fabiana, Marcello, and the Gravekeeper guy, he does help Passos multiple times and ends up saving Giovanna and their unborn child, allowing them to go on and have the family life that Max never had. And what's more is that instead of murdering everyone involved, he helps an actually honest cop, De Silva, bring Rodrigo Bronco to justice. The end of Max Payne 2 has Max more or less coming to terms with who he is and what's happened to him. It's kinda depressing and cynical, and ultimately less about how bad and terrible Max is, but rather accepting his mistakes and making some type of attempt to move on. Where, in the end of Max Payne 3, Max does more than accept who he is. He essentially overcomes his grief, and the ending becomes, well, a happy ending. Now, to me this shows an obvious attempt to subvert Max's fatal flaws from the previous games, to take specific themes and plot beats from previous titles, to take the initial cynical, misanthropic setup, and not completely compromise that darkness, but to spin it in a new light, so to speak. That is ultimately what I mean when I say I believe this is a neo-noir, in the ways that it contrasts and subverts the roots of the first game. But to contrast the two games' tones and themes only within that specific framing, to say that Max Payne 3 is good wouldn't be honest, in my opinion. Many a night I spent mulling over this conclusion, and it never sat right with me. Time and time again, I tried to film this very video, and it never felt right. Something was off, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so it has stuck with me the entire time, always there, gnawing away at my brain, until one day, it hit me. In the first two games, Max essentially resolves the plot by way of killing everyone who is vaguely involved with the large conspiracies he finds himself wrapped up in. In the first game, it's the large pharmaceutical company, and he just murders the CEO. But at the end, there's still a shadowy web of people controlling the crime and politics known as the Inner Circle. And in the second game, Vladimir Lem kills most of the members of the Inner Circle and betrays Max. But Max doesn't actually kill him because Vlad wants to take control. No. Max kills him because Mona works for the Inner Circle. So Vlad is trying to kill her. And so by the end of the first couple games, sure, the people who are doing bad things are dead. But it's not really ever seen as much of a victory. It's never framed as the good guys winning. It's never framed as if justice is being served. Because in the world of noir, there's always more crime and corruption lurking just behind the shadows. Sure, you killed some guys, but in a month's time, there will be more back to take their place. And what's more is that our protagonist isn't doing any of this to remedy the injustices of that society. Most of the time, someone has just done something to Max or someone he cares about, so he's gonna get revenge. That's kinda why crime and corruption-ridden places work as the setting and not one of the focuses of the story, because often the story is about the interpersonal drama between characters, and the themes about the darker nature of mankind come about in the interaction between the two. The setting serves as an appropriate backdrop to suggest that much of what goes on in the story isn't terribly unique. And while often the society they live in is what influences their actions, there isn't much any one individual can do to combat the large labyrinthian web of conspiracies that the noir world exists in. Now, where am I going with all of this? Okay, so hear me out. I know some people don't like a little bit of politics with their video games, but to that I would happily direct you to literally the first cutscene of the game.
Man, that favela is big.
Yep. Nothing like the view of extreme poverty to make a penthouse cocktail party really swing.
I guess they call it trickle-down economics.
Now, the game pretty clearly and consistently drives home the large gap between the rich and the poor in Sao Paulo, and the rich's need to wash away their guilt with extravagance while they try and throw money at the problem. In fact, the people you initially take to be the antagonists, the Commando Sombra, are slowly replaced with mercenaries and eventually police death squads that are increasingly better equipped. And by the end of the game, local street thugs aren't even really seen as antagonists. In this first level, we're introduced to the Bronco family, who, right after their brush with mortality, they're back to partying in nightclubs.
Ferrying the boss's broad and his dipshit of a brother out for the night so they could recover from their brush with mortality. Then again, what did I expect? These were the kind of people who went to nightclubs in helicopters.
That isn't the only time that observation is drawn. Again and again, the wealthy follow up being in traumatic, violent situations by immediately retreating back into their luxury and act like it never happened. An option of which the impoverished of Sao Paulo obviously don't have. Speaking of, for the first half of the game, our only run-ins with the large portion of the lower class living in Sao Paulo are as gang members. So for the first 7 levels, our only interaction with them is by blasting them in the face. But something changes in the 8th level, and to get into that, we need to talk about Serrano. Serrano is the antagonist for those first 7 levels, while we're shown a few others who come into play later. For the first half of the game, Serrano is the one who has Fabiana kidnapped, and we're consistently trying to get her back from him. So, in the 7th level, Max makes his way through the favelas up to where Serrano is keeping Fabiana, and where Marcello and Giovanna have just been captured for trying to save Fabiana. And when Max gets there, Serrano shoots Fabiana in the head. Now, usually in a Max Payne game, that would make Serrano the big bad guy for shooting a woman Max was trying to save. But strangely, it doesn't. And that has, in large part, to do with what happens in the 9th level, which takes place right after the 7th. Right after Serrano leaves with Marcello and Giovanna, Max quickly gets after them, but almost immediately he sees that the favela is now descending into chaos under a police raid, which entails heavily armored soldiers with assault rifles storming into people's houses and murdering them in cold blood. The local hoods who 2 missions ago were seemingly everywhere are now getting mowed down by the police with relative ease. And it's not even a fight. It's a massacre. And amongst the chaos, Max sees the Ufe bussing people away, and one of those people is Serrano. The Ufe take Marcello and Giovanna and gives them to the Crusher Prado, who, if you remember, are right-wing mercenaries with ties to both Max's dead boss and his politician brother. When they kill Marcello, Max just barely saves Giovanna, and the whole next mission is spent keeping the Crusher Prado from killing the 2 of you. When recalling events that happened a few months ago, Max remembers that it seemed like Passos and Marcello were smuggling something on a routine bodyguard job. And De Silva tells us that Passos was paid by Victor Bronco multiple times, and then De Silva, unable to actually get anything done in a corrupt police department, sends Max to a building in the center of the city run by the Crusher Prado, the building where Ufe were busing people to. Inside is worn and decrepit. When we find the people that were taken, we see their organs are being harvested. And inside is Serrano, looking like a broken shell of his former self. Max doesn't kill him. In fact, it's made clear he actually kinda pities him. When Max finds a surgeon in what appears to be an operating room who tries to buy him off, Max lets Serrano take revenge. Once he gets the people out, Max plants bombs along the foundation and goes to the roof. Once there, he argues with one of the leaders of the Crusher Prado about how ineffective Max is.
All I know is what I hear about you. You bodyguard for the Brancos. They are all dead. You help the poor. Today, many of them dead. You are a proper American hero.
At least I fucking tried.
Well done with your effort. The whole city is grateful. The great American savior of the poor.
That's right.
You think you made any difference? You think stopping this legitimate business venture is helping anyone?
Legitimate? You're stealing people's organs!
We pay for everything. We have the record.
Oh, so people can sell their livers? Their hearts? Their eyeballs? You're insane, you sick fuck!
So, the thematic implications are pretty obvious. The upper class of Sao Paulo have strangled everything from the lower classes. That these conditions were large factors in creating the crime, and between the upper class and the police allow them to get away with literal murder. But now, it has gone even beyond that, and the impoverished of the city are now selling literal parts of their body. Like, metaphor-wise, well, they're literally selling parts of their body because poverty has gotten that bad, which comes back to Serrano. By the end of the game, he isn't framed as a super evil, woman-murdering bad guy, so much as he's just a product of circumstance. Sure, he did a horrible cold-blooded murder, and that's really bad. But the things that led up to that point weren't motivated because he's a big evil bad guy. Like, of course, if some rich politician pays him to kidnap a woman, he's gonna do it. And that's another thing. We're shown that the upper class can easily influence decent people to do bad shit like they did with Passos. He did Victor Bronco's dirty work because he couldn't pass up the money. The whole plot of the game is about a right-wing politician having everyone around him murdered just to get his brother's fortune. But more importantly, it's to fabricate the crisis of a dramatic increase in violent crime, not against the poor, but against the rich, and use that to justify allowing the police to run through the favelas, executing people, and to give Victor Bronco better chances of winning campaigns as a right-wing politician who is tough on crime. It's clear that through the social conditions that create the lower classes in Sao Paulo and the overt violent control that the police exercise in part to enforce those class lines, that the main thematic antagonist of this game is... That's right! It's upper-class people with the backing of a corrupt state using their money and power to exert control over those with less than them in order to gain more power! And this is where we start to see another theme that the game is really interested in. In a corrupt system, where people are obviously being abused to the benefit of others, who has the right to take justice? Who gets to make that call? We see this idea come up time and time again. Back in New Jersey, a woman is beaten, and Max sees fit to take justice by killing this guy. Max's conversation with Neves on the roof is centered around Max's outrage against an unjust system, and Neves basically just mocks him for trying and failing to protect people. Max is basically just like, "You are exploiting and killing people." And Neves is like, "Yes, but you are also letting people die." And Max is like, "But I am trying to do a good thing and protect people." And Neves is essentially just like, "Yeah, well, I have also protected people." The reason that Serrano and the Commando Sombra stop being enemies and start being products of an unjust system is because the perspective of what getting justice would look like goes from being about saving the girl to stopping the exploitation. So yeah, Max Payne 3 is about class and justice within it. And just on a conceptual level, I think that works fine. Taking the shadowy control of the conspiracies in film noir and making them less mystified. But not only that, but by drawing direct parallels to actual problems in the real world that do exert enormous control over people's lives. But how do these ideas continue to develop within the text? Max turns himself into the police department to get after Victor Bronco, and De Silva causes a riot to help Max out. Inside, the local hoods and Commando Sombra rise up against the corrupt police, and Max finds himself wanting to aid them.
I guess our little stunt helped some other civic-minded people raise valid concerns about community relations. Their faces said it all. I was on their side, but how could they know that?
The people who were the original antagonists, Max now finds his sympathies with. Victor Bronco and Becker escape Max and then go to a nearby airport to get away on a private jet.
Rich people love to fly away.
Of course, Max catches up and practically goes through an entire army of people to get to them. In the final actual shootout of the game, Max manages to kill everyone who stands in his way and gets their Captain Becker on the ground with half of his limbs blown off. As he stands over him, he monologues about how he isn't even sure if he knows right from wrong anymore, and the player is given the choice to shoot him in the head or leave him there to die. But ultimately, it means nothing, and we're left to think about whether this was a righteous crusade for the poor or an ego trip for the broken Max. And Victor Bronco flies away on his private jet. Oh wait, nope, here comes De Silva with a car and a grenade launcher. Okay, actually then you chase after the private jet and, blow it up. And, De Silva arrests Victor Bronco, and he's killed by, or commits suicide in jail because people in the prison? And Max is happy, you know, he seems satisfied with this. And, you know, more's off in the sunset. The end, I guess. I've always really liked a lot of what's in this game. But usually at the end, for some unexplainable reason, I felt hollow. Like things never quite added up and I couldn't tell why. But now I think I get it. And for as much as I like him, my main problem is Max. There's something off about Max's character arc in this game in relation to everything its tone and themes establish. But first, I want to go into something that's always really bothered me that is a really good way to demonstrate what I'm kind of trying to get at. One of the most overt thrusts of his character is the fact that once Rodrigo Bronco gets killed, Max resolves to quit drinking and clean up his act, resolving 3 games worth of Max having an addiction that controls him. But when you start on that 7th level, Max just picks up a bottle of painkillers and says something to the effect of, "Well, I couldn't quit these." But the problem with this is that Max getting clean, by the standards of literally every game that precedes it, would definitely need to include him giving up pills. It's his main addiction, and I get that the gameplay needs to have these included, but you can't pretend to be doing a story about Max overcoming his issues if he doesn't really overcome his issues. And while annoying as this is, it's excusable, but I think it demonstrates a lack of attention as to how Max overcoming his issues is framed within the story as a whole. One of Max's biggest issues in the first 2 games is that he just fucking shoots people who get in his way. He's the cliche loose cannon to such an extreme that one time he killed like half the mafia in one rampage, and it never gets him anywhere. In the first game, his grief leads him to killing just a whole dang lot of dudes, some of which are responsible for his wife and baby's death, and he gets away with it, and he's still miserable. In the second game, his trigger-happy selfishness has him murdering a whole nother dang lot of dudes, and another police officer. Over and over, we see that Max's defining flaw isn't really his addictions or his inability to protect those around him, but the way those things create a sort of depressed rage stew of grief that manifests itself and perpetuates a cycle of violence. And this lends itself to an odd thing with how the idea of justice is portrayed. There's a weird thing about how this game conceptualizes the idea of justice and what it looks like. And maybe it's just because it's a video game and a third-person shooter, but the game ties the idea of justice exclusively to violent retribution and murder. Now, that isn't to say that none of this murder is justified, and it is, admittedly, very fun to do a bang boom shooty time on these naughty boys. But whenever we're confronted with the broad injustices being blatantly committed, the only question is only ever, should we kill them? Or do we have the right to kill them? Alright, so let's talk about Becker. Becker is one of the corrupt UFE officers who is in cahoots with Victor Bronco and very obviously is exploitative of Sao Paulo. In the last shootout, he yells at Max about how he's a terrorist putting other people in danger. The entire game we're confronted with the idea that while this system is exploitative and very obviously bad, Max is also not necessarily within his right to just come around shooting the place up, trying to save the day. That maybe rich guys using Max as a patsy isn't a good enough reason to lead the charge through these city slums. That maybe Max isn't the one who has the right to take justice in this scenario. At the beginning of the game, we see a flash forward to the end. Becker's on the ground with an arm and a leg blown off. Max points a gun at him while monologuing about whether he can genuinely make this judgment call. Whether he is the one who has the right to take justice by way of murder because of a system that doesn't really affect him. Because that isn't justice. It's revenge. And by starting the game with this, it is signaling to us that this is the pivotal moment in Max's character, and the main question and moral dilemma we will be confronted with. And when this finally happens at the end of the game, it makes us decide which side we're on.
This was it. It was almost over. So I guess I'd become what they wanted me to be. A killer. Some rent-a-clown with a gun who puts holes in other bad guys. Well, that's what they had paid for, so in the end, that's what they got. Say what you want about Americans, but we understand capitalism. You buy yourself a product and you get what you pay for. And these chumps had paid for some angry gringo without the sensibilities to know right from wrong. Here I was, about to execute this poor bastard like some dime store angel of death, and I realized They were correct. I wouldn't know right from wrong if one of them was helping the poor and the other was banging my sister.
But the problem with this is that ultimately, it's a completely vapid notion. Because the game decides, no, it actually doesn't matter whether or not Max has the right reasons to try and fix this system by way of murdering everyone. It doesn't matter whether or not your reasons for killing people are genuine, or whether or not you choose to continue killing because, oh look, there's De Silva. Let's get into an awesome chase on a runway and blow people up in cars with a grenade launcher, then stop that fucker Victor Bronco. Don't think about whether or not it's your place to be doing this, or whether or not you even have the capacity to decide, because it's climax time, or it's time to climax, or time to blow your load, Victor Bronco. Fuck up. So, when in Max Payne 3 we find Max at his lowest point, thrown into this situation because he got so angry when a mobster's son hit a girl that he shot his whole crew down, and that forced him to go with Passos to Sao Paulo, where he gets roped into a situation that he says is just repeating the past, causing him to perpetuate the same cycles of grief and violence that he always lapses into, when we're shown a story about a violent man trying to redeem himself by doing the same thing he's always done, that goes out of its way to even show more moral gray area than its predecessors, that specifically questions both the righteousness and effectiveness of those actions, with that character walking off into the sunset as emotional, happy end music attempts to tug at the heartstrings, with the calm assurance that all the people we killed were the right people. It's like, okay, you know, cool, I guess. I'm sure glad Max was able to kick the whiskey and start drinking sody pops. And this is where Max Payne 3's attempted balancing act of gritty neo-noir and the thematic ideas of class struggle just struggles miserably. Okay, so let's go for the most obvious diss. White Savior the video game. Or, how did that one guy put it?
The great American savior of the poor.
Yeah, that. I mean, it's not wrong. It's about an angry white guy going to a foreign country and making its socio-economic issues his moral crusade for pseudo-redemption. I mean, he used to draw references between nightclubs and Norse mythology. And now he just calls every place he's in a shithole. Okay, the writing's obviously different, but come on. The real problem is that Max basically single-handedly saves the day for all these oppressed people. And sure, he gets helped by Passos and De Silva, but it's not like when the actual fighting of the mercenaries get going, they're constantly helping Max. No, the game consistently frames it as Max mowing his way through these corrupt forces pretty much by himself. He is the hero, and he ultimately decides how he is going to save the day. At the end, when you stop Victor Bronco, Max is about to shoot him, but De Silva tells him not to so he can go to jail, and Max lets him arrest him. But that's the thing. It's Max letting him live and letting De Silva arrest him. They're not framed as equals. Max is framed as having the authority in the situation, like he has the right to kill Victor Bronco, even though De Silva is quite literally an officer of the law. And what's more is that in this game, Max doesn't just kill all the bad guys, he saves the day. And none of this is framed as bad or even questionable, but rather just a bit too violent. But this speaks to a deeper problem. The elephant in the room. Or should I say, the pig. One of the reasons the other games have crazy conspiracies at the center with shadowy organizations that were often pretty removed from the real world is because when Max kills all the baddies, there's always going to be more. He can't really save the day or get over his personal grief because he keeps doing the same thing. But In Max Payne 3, he finds himself at the center of a fully motivated, shady conspiracy with real-world implications. And this thing that ends up being more complicated than, Vladimir Lem is taking over all the inner circle because he wants all the power and cool nightclubs in New York. And it's showing how connections between people in power, the police, and the money they hold over people with less than them can create an unbalanced system where people give all that they can and ruin their lives just to attempt to survive. But in the end, the specific systemic social issues that were being brought up explicitly as complicated are solved by a foreign dude running around with a gun, shooting all the right bad people. But the thing about both the world of noir and the real world is that as long as these conditions persist, then the problem will keep coming back up. Shooting the right people doesn't help because A, Max can't shoot literally every person to end class differences in Brazil. And B, that's not good optics, brah. Like, sure, Da Silva, ostensibly a good cop, arrested Victor Bronco. But the conditions that kept him from doing his job in the first place haven't really changed at all. What, the Broncos were the only corrupt rich people in Sao Paulo? Becker was the only corrupt police captain? They were the only ones intentionally disenfranchising the poor for their own purposes? I don't buy it. We barely see a slice of the extent of what's actually going on. The favela raid, all those cops are still there. What's more is, by the end, the genuine exploration between the power struggle of the rich and the poor that was set up for the first 95% of the game seems to be little more than the backdrop for Max's redemption story. A redemption story which specifically draws notion to the idea that Max may just be doing this for his own ego. All the ideas about what makes for true justice are just kind of dropped in the very last second. And ultimately it comes out that he's just trying to do some good, which I guess is all fine and dandy, but it's a story in a series where the main character consistently kills people for what seem like good reasons in the moment, but it ultimately goes wrong because he was doing it for his self-interest. And this game has him finally coming out on top, saving the day, righting his wrongs, by doing the same thing he has literally always done. And what's more is that the systematic issues that were being brought up are just swept under the rug because some rich guys and a lot of mercenaries were murdered. And the tone of the neo-noir and film noir aspects that are consistent with the Max Payne series are shifted at the last moment for an ending that feels self-congratulatory and saccharine. Like, Max, my boy, you did it. You sure shot him good. The story simultaneously brings attention to Max's character flaws and the broader systemic injustices that make for an abusive system, and the game attempts to subvert the tone and themes of the first two, but in doing so, it comes to an awkward ending where neither the established darker tone or the social issues it brings up actually go anywhere meaningful. It starts as a contemporary neo-noir version of Max Payne that plays with real issues of class struggle, but the more it starts to realize it's going there, it's like it gets nervous and hesitant, and wraps it all up with an out-of-place happy ending where our main character gets to do the same thing he's always done before. Max still carelessly wrecks his body with pills and goes around shooting anyone that gets in his way, but this time, he's in a different country. And he kills them so good that he fixes the justice system. And that is the contradicting case of Max Payne 3. It sets itself up as an extension and subversion of the darker aspects of film noir in the first game. It ties the shady government or business control aspects of film noir that were mostly subtextual in the first game to actual reflections of real-world class struggle. But when it ends, it betrays both of those sensibilities. It might have been able to get away with having a slapdash happy ending had it not tied its issues to actual problems. But when it does, it comes off as dishonest. Like it tries to speak to something real, and just ends up letting the main character save the day by shooting a bunch of people. And even though the game pointed to a system being the problem, rather than just some bad guys, it betrays that. By the end, it basically says, no, actually, bad guys are the problem, and the solution is to shoot them. While a lot of the time noir tries to speak to some intersection between good and bad in mankind, and how it manifests in each person, but the bad things about our protagonist's behavior and the corrupt system are waved away, and it ends with Max walking off in the sunset. The main lesson about the intersection between poverty, money, and powerful people who are controlling both is, well, all the right people got shot. And Max seems more satisfied than ever. It's almost like the writers remembered they were working for a multi-billion-dollar games company, and towards the end they realized that maybe making the main thematic antagonist of your story being wealthy people and the exploitation they can control and exert over people might be a bad idea. Why is that?
You load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt.
Okay, so there's this game studio you might have heard of. They're called Rockstar. They made a few games. You might have heard about them. Most notably, the highest profiting piece of entertainment of all time, Lemmings 2: The Tribes. Okay, but seriously, these guys are revered heroes to the gaming community, responsible for hit after hit, memorable game after memorable game. Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, San Andreas, The Warriors, Bully, Midnight Club, Manhunt, GTA 4, Red Dead Redemption, LA Noire. I'd be hard-pressed to think of another AAA developer with the same consistently solid track record as Rockstar had for almost 20 years. They are responsible for the single most profitable piece of entertainment in history, GTA 5. And still these guys find it in them to treat their employees like shit. Just look into Rockstar's history of how they treat developers, and you'll find stories going back almost a decade that shows an absolute disregard for their employees' well-being, and it has been reported on time and time again over the years, and it still happens. Time and time again, Rockstar Games are revealed to having been made off the backs of developers made to crunch. When Red Dead Redemption 2 came out last year, there were reports of some employees working 100-hour work weeks. So obviously now is when I should mention that Max Payne 3 was built heavily on the backs of developers made to crunch. And this is to say nothing of the culture of fear that is used to enforce these mechanisms. By every indication, Rockstar isn't just an unethical company. It's a regular old boys club too, where people who are not actively in the loop of the higher executive circles, then they are usually demeaned and disrespected. Apparently, frequent discussion topics between the higher-ups include the size of female employees' breast. There was apparently an ex-higher-up who acted as an enforcer who was only let go in fear it would lead to greater public scrutiny. Attempts to speak up for yourself or not go with every single idea and thought of the higher-ups put you at potential risk. Not only that, but it's an environment where to move your way up in the ladder, you are expected to actively join the higher-ups in excessive partying involving liquor and stripping and gambling. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but not joining in on the excess or being enthusiastic about all the ideas of the most powerful people is liable to make a dev an outsider. And the people who don't go with all the slightest petty whims of those in power, fired. Shit can. Their names get scrubbed from the credits. Their contribution is wiped clean. These are arguably the biggest game developers in the world right now. And yet the people in charge are creating an environment where their employees are overworked, afraid of the people in charge, and afraid of losing their jobs. The workload and stress and the human fear of those who hold power over them all pile up, while these devs just pour so much of their time and energy into these excessive, sprawling games. And people work like that for so long, sometimes years at a time. Each giant project's end always means that there's another one that has to be even bigger and better than the last one. Budgets and man-hours elevating with every new title, sucking them dry of their energy and passion. And when you work like that with the shitty bosses and the stress of working every weekend pushing you to your limits, it drains the life out of you. Max Payne 3 is a hyperbolic video game. While it does try to touch upon real-world issues, it does so without much grace or nuance. But one of the thematic cores of the story is of a system where a few people with money and power reign over others in a decadent consumerist excess. It has gotten so bad where the people of Sao Paulo are selling their bodies, giving away parts of themselves, just to survive in this system. The people in power don't actually understand what's going on with the impoverished in the favelas. They just know how to exploit them for their own benefit. At the end of the day, none of these people actually seem to get that they are part of a large system that is sucking the soul from the people. They all see themselves as just doing what's necessary for what they want without seeing how short-sighted and selfish it is. Or, in the words of Rockstar Games' Dan Houser, it's like they see us as the bad guys. But to end it there, I think, would be a bit too easy. To see a game with these messages and to point out that the game is about people being exploited and say, well, actually, Rockstar exploits people as well, so they suck and are bad. And that would be true to an extent. They do suck, and the things they are doing to their employees is bad. But they aren't doing it in a vacuum. Rockstar isn't run by a few bad eggs taking advantage of their power. No, by all accounts, their behavior in the game industry is depressingly routine. Just off the top of my head, I can name a bunch of other game developers forcing their devs to crunch. EA, Activision, Epic, all of them massive companies making literal billions of dollars, and still they continue to exploit workers to save a few bucks. Rockstar exists as part of a system that thrives on exploitation. But that doesn't mean that they and all the other shit-tier AAA companies shouldn't be stopped, and the employees within them shouldn't get justice. And obviously not some angry, borderline psychopath justice, but actual justice, where the people who are being hurt by that system's lives are actually made better, where they get to put their foot down and say no, and stop being exploited so a few at the top can live in decadence. I'm not talking about shifting what dickhead assholes exploit them. I'm talking about actual change to the ideas that govern people's lives. Not just aesthetics.
There was something disturbingly familiar about the paper before me. The handwriting was all pretty curves.
You're in a YouTube video, Bree.
The truth was a burning red crack through my brain. Jump cuts to mask my mistakes. Colorful words flying around mixed with playful editing. Every word carefully curated to make a long-winded point about a 7-year-old game. I was in a YouTube video essay. Funny as hell. It was the most horrible thing I could think of.